Whistler.
Whoops.
Got it.
Okay.
I'm beginning with this self-portrait of his for the simple reason that it is characteristic of this man that he created, I do not know how many self-portraits in various media. He was, as I'm sure you all know, an accomplished artist, not only in what and how he represented what he chose to represent, many portraits, for instance, of other people, not just himself, but he also was a master of several media. And we're going to look at as much of that as we can in the following 30 minutes or so. I added this footnote, I guess you could say, that you see on the left, which is similar to, you see my cursor here, to this image, and it's an icon that he adopted early on of a butterfly. And then in 1880, he decided to add a scorpion's tail, which you see here, which is absolutely indicative of his art, beautiful, sublime, and his personality, which was by all indications very unpleasant. And I'm going to begin here formally with a couple of quotes by one of my favorite art history critics. He's no longer with us, unfortunately, but he's a giant of a man in the field of art criticism, Robert Hughes. And I'm quoting from his book, Nothing If Not Critical. Just a few sentences here. The man, Whistler, was an egomaniac, a fop, and a publicity-crazed liar. Traits that perhaps should, but actually do not, prevent people from being serious artists. He lived most of his life as a string of fictions and adjustments. He was fixated on his mother, and we'll see that famous portrait of his mother in a few, and did not marry until he was 54 and she was dead. His mannerisms were effeminate, and when excited, he pranced about like a peahen on hot bricks. Whistler was enraptured by the half-seen, the evanescent, the image that vanishes almost before it can be named. And this brings to mind his famous nocturne that John Ruskin so criticized, which of course is coming up as well. Whistler loathed narrative and fervently espoused the idea of art for art's sake. And that comes just a little later in his early art career, by the way. But this led to his abstract and musical titles, arrangement, symphony, nocturne, and the like. In one of his early visits to Paris, and I want to backtrack a little bit and give you a little more chronology leading up to what I'm going to talk about right now briefly. He was invited into the circle that included Courbet, and this is, of course, Courbet's most famous painting, The Stonebreakers, and another painting by Courbet, which may have influenced Whistler in his penchant for portraits of beautiful, sexy ladies, and also of Manet. And of course, this icon of Manet's outshone most any painting of the time. And then this portrait by Manet of Émile Zola, which I am going to, in a few minutes, compare to Whistler's mother and talk about what I think at this point in time, so in the 60s, late 60s, Whistler learned from these persons who were representative of the realism movement which was huge, as many of you know, in the middle and latter years of the 19th century. But let's now begin at the beginning. Whistler was born in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1834. When later it is recorded, someone mentioned his birthplace, he said, "I was born wherever I want to be born." In other words, he was not delighted that he had been born in Lowell, Massachusetts, of all places, the industrial city that it was. And as we know, has kind of built itself up from its 19th century bootstraps. In any event, the family then moved 3 years later to Connecticut, where his father his father worked for the railroad. And he was so good that he became chief engineer of the Boston and Albany Railroad, which garnered him and his family quite a lot of money and allowed his father to buy for them a large house in Connecticut. But now this led to his invitation, his father's invitation in 1842, so just a few years later, to Russia. He has been invited by Nicholas I, and he developed for Russia, for Nicholas, their first railroad. And there, and this is the point of boring you with all of this information, Whistler was engaged in his first art lessons. Just 5 years later, 47 to 48, the family is in London, and then back to Connecticut. There, Whistler was sent to West Point. His mother, who was a very pious woman, had thought that perhaps her son, to whom she was absolutely devoted, would perhaps do well in the ministry, but that didn't work out. So he was sent to West Point instead, where other members of the family had attended, and also, by the way, where his father had taught drawing. He was dismissed. Whistler was dismissed for, let's just say, insubordination after a couple of years. But what he had learned there was mapping and map making. And he spent a while subsequently working for the U.S. Coast Survey, where he learned, making maps, where he learned the art of etching. In 1855, he arrived in Paris and never returned to the United States. He basically spent his time between Paris, many trips there, and then London, where he settled into a house built by a friend of his. He called the White House. There he was introduced to this circle of Courbet and Manet, and got involved because of them in the realist movement, as I mentioned. Now, let's look at aspects of this portrait as a portrait of realism, very matter of fact, and without emotion, and more or less foursquare. A lot of angles, sharp angles, and as you can see, rectangular shapes. A dramatic, I would say, quietly dramatic portrait of this talented writer. And what you see here in Whistler's mother, arrangement in gray and black, number 1, is very much the same thing. And by the way, he didn't intend a portrait of his mother. A model of his didn't show up, and she at the time was living with him. She moved in, I forget the date, in any event, moved in with her son and stayed there for the rest of her life, taking care of him. So apparently she walks into the studio, his model hasn't showed up, and he asks her to model for him. And at first she's standing, she's an old lady, and she gets tired. So she asked if she could sit down. And so she did, and he created this iconic portrait that is like the Emile Zola portrait, I think, not only in terms of color, grays, blacks, just a few other pigments, very barely seen in this image, which one of my sources tells me is influenced by his influence in Japanese art. I'm not too sure about that, but it is a work which is rectangular, black and white, and echoes his mother's demeanor in terms of its quietude, its subtlety, maybe that's a better word, and rectilinearity. And back to this portrait of Emile Zola for just a moment. Part of this portrait is hidden by my face and others, but you can see here on the right-hand corner, excuse me, and over here to the left, images which are clearly influenced by the interest in Japanese art that emerged after Japan was opened for trade in 1858, emerged among many artists, as some of you probably are well aware, in Europe after that momentous date. And here we have a definition of Japanisme. If you wish to read it, I'm not going to read it to you. Whistler, as he developed his style, let's say, his interest in realism went by the wayside. It's not that the portraits that you will see, of which many of you are familiar, I'm sure, are not realistic and don't represent the sitters in a realistic way. But what he was interested in was the expression, art for art's sake, as we say, and celebrating the beauty of the object and laying aside the, as this definition says, of moral or utilitarian considerations. So he moved away from those first influences that so dominated his art early on, of Courbet and Manet and others of the realist tradition. He, let's see, traveled to Paris after he moved to London in 1859. And when he came back from Paris, a very short trip in 1861, he painted this work. It originally was titled The White Girl. And as I've noticed in parentheses here, this is a representation of a mistress of his who was a darling of his, Joanna Heffernan. He later added the title Symphony in White No. 1, as he came to understand, as I mentioned earlier, quoting Robert Hughes, the relationship between painting and music. So here we have an image of this beautiful red-haired young lady, and the painting, as you can see, is made up primarily of nuances of white. I don't know if one can say shades of white, but variations of that delightful hue that is otherwise colorless. She holds a lily in her left hand, and she stands on a bearskin rug. And the way in which, although if you'd ask Whistler, probably he would say, well, there's no subject matter. But the way in which this image has been interpreted is that that the lily alludes to the symbol of virginity, or is a symbol of virginity. And you have the bear's bestial, quoting here, threatening stare at the bottom of the figure. And so we have an image that perhaps can be seen as both the loss of innocence and innocence itself. This also is a portrait of Joanna. And again, he added the first portion of this title after the fact. So this is the little white girl. And as you can see, he has added here a Japanese inspired fan. These flowers are in the style of Japanese paintings. And you have more of that reference to Japanese art here above the mantle. And what I love particularly about this work is the nuanced position or positioning of this left hand over the mantle. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Now, this is the first painting that he exhibited with the title that he gave it when he created the work, Symphony in White, number 3. Once again, we have Joanna here. I don't know the identity of this model. It could be simply a variation on her. They look very similar to me, but I don't know anything about that. It was the first work that Whistler exhibited under such a musical title. And this was in, let me see, I think it was in probably 67 that he exhibited this painting. And I could not share this quote with you. And again, I'm reading from a source. One critic remarked about this painting that the painting was, quote, not precisely a symphony in white, because one could see other colors in the painting as well. Never short of a reply, Whistler responded by asking the critic whether he believed, quote, that a symphony in F contains no other note, but shall be a continued repetition of F, 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 fool. And that's Whistler. I thought you might be interested in this painting for the simple reason that it shows the artist at work in his studio. And it also, like the previous paintings, but I think more so, is giving you an impression of the painterly, sketch-like rendering of figures here as he continues his work as a portraitist, also of himself standing over here. He was, of course, an exquisite colorist, not just nuances of white, but I mean, look at this painting. The whites, the blues, the silvery yellows, quite striking. Joanna made the mistake, I guess one could say, and you'll hear a little bit more about this in John's reading, of posing nude for then Whistler's great friend, Gustave Courbet. And this caused Whistler to dismiss her and also to dismiss Courbet as one of his friends. Entering his studio, then came this young girl, Maud Franklin. And you will hear much more about Maud in John's reading. But here, I think, is one of the most telling and evocative portraits Whistler perhaps ever created. This woman, young girl, I should say, when she came to him, had been mistreated. She was very unsure of herself and really miserable. And you see that in this painting, created with these nuances of grays, brownish greens, a little bit of pink or mauve. And this is a very good slide, by the way. So it illustrates this painting, I think, quite well. Another portrait of Maud, arrangement in white and black. As you can see, she was a beauty, as was Joanna. And like Joanna, interestingly enough, I thought, she acted not only as Whistler's primary model, but also business manager. And I was mentioning this to John earlier, and he said, yeah, he basically kept him not out of debt, but out of jail, managing his finances. In 1880-81, Whistler began painting with watercolors. And here is Maud. You'll see this painting again later on as John speaks. And she's, as you can see, relaxing rather theatrically on a couch in the studio, another figure nearby. But what I remarked to myself about his use of watercolor, it's very watery, very loose, but also, descriptive when necessary, but otherwise, the kind of handling of watercolor, I think, is very difficult to, at which to be successful, quite frankly. I couldn't leave you without introducing this work. Maybe some of you have seen this at the Freer Gallery. And it's an entire room. The centerpiece that you see here is a work of his Princess, the Land of Porcelain. And this peacock room was created in collaboration with an architect by the name of Thomas Jekyll. Okay, here's his name. And the whole representative of aestheticism and Japanisme for the London house of the shipping magnate and Baron Frederick Leland, I think it is, who was at the time a friend of Whistler's. They subsequently had a falling out. In any event, here's one view of the room. It was created fundamentally to showcase Leland's collection of Oriental pottery, which, as you can see, is quite extensive. And then also here. And I think you can understand why this is an excellent, exquisite example of not only Japanisme, but also of aestheticism, art for art's sake. There's no message here. It's just simply exquisitely beautiful. Something about the execution of this room, however, which was criticized, and perhaps rightly so, is that portions of the walls were covered in cordovan leather, which, as I won't say legend, but as sources tell us, was salvaged from the ships of the Spanish Armada. So exquisite and priceless objects, materials. And what did Whistler do? He just painted over them. After the falling out of Leland and after his death, Freer, the founder of the Freer Gallery, purchased the room and then made sure that it was open to the public in his gallery. In the early 1870s, I'm looking for the date here, doesn't really matter, I guess. Let's call it 1871. we don't know why, but Whistler traveled to Chile. And when he came back, he's living in London, remember. When he came back, he began painting these nocturnes, and there are three of them, which basically were painted not all together, but you could say in relationship to one another. And this is the first nocturne, Blue and Gold, Old Battersea Bridge. Now, this is a bridge that no longer exists, and it was constructed out of wood, and maybe you can see some vestige of that woodiness here in this image. I'm quoting now from what John will read for you, because when I read this, I was so struck by what he had written. I needed to share it with you as an introduction to this work, the next, and the next. And it is Maud, remember Maud? She's speaking about Whistler's art. And she begins, there is line, but there are no lines. She looked at the water, the sky, the boats, line, but no lines, a wash of color, the paint, thinly applied, thin as breath upon the surface of glass, has depth. It is as though you were looking through the atmosphere, through the fog, into the night. There is distance in the canvas. You don't look at the painting, you see into it. And you see all of that here. It's just remarkable. And he is, as far as I know, the first artist to create such enigmatic, poetic images. No subject, I would say, but color, atmosphere. I apologize for this image. I could not find one that didn't have the emblem of the Tate where it resides as part of the image. So this was the next that he created, Nocturne Black and Gold, the Fire Wheel. And you see many of the same let's say colors, and we have an atmosphere here which is even deeper, I think, because black is a prominent color. He quite favored black after white as one of the major pigments he thought was most representative. And then, of course, there is this painting, Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket. When this was exhibited, and probably some of you are aware of this because it's a very famous incident, so to speak, in the history of art and also in the life of Whistler. Ruskin, John Ruskin, said that it was an abomination. This isn't a quote. It was an abomination. It was as if Whistler were slinging paint in the eyes of the viewer. What it is an explosion of fireworks over the Thames. And I think we all can appreciate that. Not many people at the time it was created could. However, Whistler sued Ruskin for his abominable criticism, and he wrote a book in 1890 entitled The Gentle Art of Making Enemies. And in it, Whistler recreates much of the conversation that was had at the trial in his defense, and of course against him as well. And as Whistler Whistler states in this portion of the book, what he gives us is a defense of his art, which is very close to being a defense of abstract painting. Now, abstract painting didn't exist at the time. It doesn't exist as such by definition until after World War II in New York City, for instance, where it began, as far as I know. And what we find in this statement regarding his painting here is a statement which stands as the major one of the modern point of view in painting. So he was quite ahead of his time. But long story short, he won the case. But as some of you probably know, he was only awarded a farthing, and then it was demanded of him that he pay the court costs. Well, this bankrupted him. So he lost his house, he lost the White House. And because of that loss, he spent some time again in Paris. But let me share with you just, let me see, what do I have here? Just a few of his words from his defense here. And it reiterates what I've already said about him early on. As music is the poetry of sound, so is painting the poetry of sight. And the subject matter has nothing to do with harmony of sound or color. And then he said, he writes here, art should be independent of all claptrap, should stand alone, and appeal to the artistic sense of eye or ear without confounding this with emotions entirely foreign to it, as devotion, pity, love, patriotism, and the like. All these have no kind of concern with it, and that is why I insist on calling my works arrangements and harmonies. From Paris, he traveled to Venice. He was commissioned for a series of etchings, actually. This is after the trial, after he went bankrupt. And when his etchings weren't working out very well, he turned to pastels. And so here is this delightful view of the harbor of Venice, and you can see the dome of San Marco right here, and the Piazza San Marco, and so forth here. So he works in oils, and then demonstrates his ability, right, creative, modern, I should say, even ability in watercolor. And you'll see some etchings of his a little bit later, and he works in pastels. Very versatile. So here is one of his largest etchings, which he created in Venice. And when he returned to London with these works, the pastels and the etchings, of which there were quite a number, and you'll see a few more of them during John's reading, he was lauded, finally recognized as a very fine and creative and innovative artist. Oh, an etching, by the way, if you're not familiar, is traditionally done on a copper plate. So you have a copper plate or a lead plate, but it has to be a metal plate that's soft. And it's covered with wax, which has been melted and dyed a dark color, dark brown, black, that is then smeared on the plate, and a sharp instrument, like a needle, is used to draw into the wax. And then the plate is immersed in what we call a mordant. And this eats away at the lines, into the lines, I should say, and into the plate. And that's where you have, that's how these lines are created in this medium. And then you melt off the wax and ink the plate, and here we are. Although it can be a little more complicated than that, but that's basically the method. Relatively late self-portrait, but he will live into the next century. You'll see this portrait several times again, the whole thing. But I like this because he looks so arrogant and so full of himself as he, as he squints out of his monocle attached to his right eye. Now, does anyone have any questions or comments about Whistler thus far? Anything at all? Okay. Whistler's Mistress, a reading by John Smolens.
Is it my turn?
It's your turn.
Okay, right. I just sit right here.
Yeah. We'll come over so people can see you.
No, they don't need to see me because they're going to see the images.
Oh, right. Okay.
Can you hear me all right from there? Yeah, I guess. Okay. Whistler's Mistress. Maud Franklin stands on the sidewalk of Rue de Bac, watching them leave the cafe. She has rented her apartment in the 7th arrondissement just to aggravate Whistler, and because she knows it will exercise his wife's jealous heart. Since he married the widow, Beatrice Godwin, there is now just this, following them through Parisian streets crowded with horse-drawn hansoms. She waits for the moment when Beatrice, arm in arm with Whistler, senses that they are again being stalked. Beatrice gazes across the street, a look intended to demolish Maud, to expel her into oblivion. Maud stares back, dead-eyed. It's a matter of possession, hers legal, Maud's moral. Possession is a matter of time, of lying in his bed, of bearing his children, of posing endlessly for his canvases. The moral always trumps the legal. As they continue toward their apartment, Whistler walks more slowly than he used to, a peacock of a man, with the white feather of his hair rising above his forehead, his mustaches, his monocle on the black ribbon, his bamboo walking stick. He is shorter than his hefty young wife, and his stride is halting, bridled. With Maud, he used to walk like a man so much taller. He would strut and preen, always on display. Maud provided height, stature. He could never admit to that. Whistler's reputation is again secure. His paintings have finally brought him fame and fortune. Despite his genius as an artist, though, he will always be a small man, a vain man, his short man's combative disposition his only defense. What he lacks in height, he makes up for in overbearing confidence. Maud has known him since she was a child, a coxcomb, always seeking higher ground, always angling to be victorious. She was 15. In his studio, the adults would lean toward the easel, leering at the canvas. Such red hair, such large, deep eyes. They were in awe of how he had captured the child. Whistler's painting had rendered her invisible. She was not a girl, but a subject. They said that she's the embodiment of such a range of emotions that there was a disconcerting sense of inquiry in her stare, that she was innocent yet forlorn. But they knew nothing about how she felt. She had been sitting so long that her right foot had fallen asleep. She needed to urinate. Her range of emotions revolved around his command that she hold still until he was finished. His mistress, Joanna, would pose in white dresses, never looking like she needed to urinate. Joanna was a bright symphony, Maud, an amorphous nocturne. Stupidly, Joanna agreed to model for Gustave Courbet, the tragic era, posing nude for another artist. Whistler was outraged, and it was the end of Joanna in white. Maud's becoming his mistress was not a matter of submission, but of possession. Though he always rendered her fully clothed, he studied how she moved. In bed, his fingers coursed over her skin, seeking the definition of tendon and muscle, his touch light as the china bristles in his brush. This was her secret. On the canvases, she was her own creation. He could paint only what she gave him. He selected the garments, she chose the attitude. He called his paintings arrangements, but she was the arrangement. He boasted about everything, but mostly about his ability to just see. When she told him that he could only see what she revealed, they argued. So many arguments. He wasn't alive if he wasn't working, wasn't arguing. She knew how to argue with him, another secret of hers, and she possessed him for years. There is line, but there are no lines. She looked at the water, the sky, the boats. Line, but no lines. A wash of color, the paint thinly applied, thin as breath upon the surface of glass, has depth. It is as though you were looking through the atmosphere, through the fog, into the night. There is distance in the canvas. You don't look at the painting, you see into it. This frightened her. He was looking elsewhere. Angrily, she loved him more. For the suggestion of the sun, of a shadow, of a moored ship perched upon its own reflection. He referred to himself in the third person, Whistler, or the master. He was capable of love, she told him often. He was incapable of love, she told him often, other than love of himself, of his work. And his mother, of course, a severe woman, pure American granite, a woman only a son could love. He had great need. He couldn't be alone. He never sat still. They didn't even own a couch, all straight back chairs. He didn't walk about. He rushed, his patent leather shoes scuffing the floors in brisk dance steps. His palette was an entire table. Though Maud's calling card read Mrs. Whistler, she was not accepted into society. He referred to her as Madame, a breach of etiquette, a bit of scandal he could wield in the face of convention. Even the nights he spent out with his friends, talking and arguing in cafes and clubs, she felt his need, which he brought back to her, knocking the wind out of her in bed, collapsing on her in exhaustion. His fingers no longer traced the shape of her muscles. His hands sought the marrow of her bones. Her skin felt pummeled, malleable, as though he was removing all of her lines, leaving only an impression of her. And the morning light revealed bruises on her arms, breasts, thighs, and ribs. Paint these, she once shouted, and he wouldn't look at blemished flesh in the light of day. Whistler argued with everyone, tailors, gallery managers, patrons, artists, critics, friends. Most of all with friends, Oscar Wilde, Henry James, Aubrey Beardsley. And then, after a friendship had been demolished, he would revel in the telling of how he had bested his friend, obliterated him with the brilliance of his art, the savagery of his wit. In cafes, crowds gathered around him to hear his stories, often utter fabrications, told in his high-pitched, strident voice. To Americans, he sounded British. To the British, he sounded American. A man born in Massachusetts, raised in St. Petersburg, expelled from West Point, a peripatetic vision. In newspapers, he published letters chastising his critics. He told patrons that no matter how much money they spent. They could never really own one of his paintings, that it was a privilege to have possession of his work, if only briefly. He signed his paintings with the image of a butterfly with a scorpion's tail. And with the bruises, she failed to bleed. When she informed him that she was pregnant, he told her to don a fur coat, turn her back to the canvas, and then look over her shoulder at him, all to conceal her swollen belly. He wanted to disown it. He wanted no intrusions. He'd had children. One child, Charles, which Whistler had with a parlor maid named Louisa Fanny Hanson, was adopted by Joanna. Whistler kept his distance, occasionally sending money. It would be the same with Maud's baby. A child would be an imposition. Maud would never again be the girl sitting before his canvas. Whistler became enraged with John Ruskin. After viewing his nocturne in black and gold, The Falling Rocket, Ruskin wrote that Whistler was a coxcomb who asked, quote, 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Whistler sued for libel, demanding £1,000. In the courtroom, Whistler parried smartly with the counselor, and the jury found in his favor. Yet they awarded him damages of 1 farthing and ordered him to cover court costs. In the wake of the trial, they were both overwhelmed by Whistler's public humiliation and the fact that his debts amounted to £4,500. Their home, the White House, which had been built by the architect John Godwin, was put on the market. As Maud approached term, Whistler sent her to Paris. He remained in London to sell all of their possessions. In February, she delivered a girl, Ione. When she returned to London, Whistler was destitute. The only way she could stay with him was to give the child to foster parents. Maud walks down her side of Rue de Bac, never taking her eyes off of them. Whistler and Beatrice pause in front of their apartment building, and Maud stops across the street. They confer a moment until he opens the door for her and she enters the front hall. Rather than following her inside, Whistler closes the door. He turns and gazes toward Maud, raising one hand to adjust his monocle. His sneer is derisive. His expression is the same as when he painted her. He is just seeing her, and in fear she holds still. Whistler heads straight for her, his bamboo cane tapping the cobblestones. Bankrupt, Whistler agreed to a commission of a series of a dozen etchings in Venice. He planned to be there for 2 to 3 months. He viewed it as exile, and the project, which he had first rejected, was strictly for commercial purposes. Bleak winter days in the cold, damp Adriatic wind, the Bora, but he was working, and he soon became the center of American artists living there. He was the master once again. Despite the chill, Maud took to the canals of Venice, the fog-shrouded lagoon. It seemed a new beginning for both of them. Whistler hired a gondolier by the month, and they would cruise the canals in search of ancient doorways, courtyards, and alleys. Whistler sought the dark, hidden Venice, places inhabited by washerwomen and beggars, places that reflected the erosion and decay of a noble floating city. He understood deterioration and loss. It was in the weathered stones and tiles, the moldy, water-stained plaster walls. They remained in Venice for 14 months. He used a set of dentist's needles to create his etchings. It was the worst Venetian winter in 30 years, and his hands would become so stiff that he would have to stop working on the cold copper plate. When he couldn't etch, he turned to pastels using bright-colored chalk. They returned to London in November 1880 with dozens of etchings and perhaps 100 pastels, but they were both in poor health. He from the Venetian winter, she pregnant again. For the second time, she went to Paris to deliver the child. another girl who died in infancy. Whistler's new work caused a sensation in London. The master was back from exile. He exasperated people with surgical precision. He wrote to newspapers arguing down critics. He was revered for his art, famous for his arrogance. Perpetually late for dinner invitations, he would sweep into the room and insist that hosts not apologize for beginning without him. Invitations to dinners and parties still eluded Maud. She modeled less frequently for him. Success made the master more intolerable, more impatient, more demanding. But there was comfort and ease now, and she was often left alone. For years, alone, until 6 years later, after returning to London, John Godwin died. The designer of the White House, a notorious womanizer, he was one of the few men Whistler admired. When his wife Beatrice would come to the studio, this younger woman with the broad face and silly hats seemed to transform the very air in the room. One day, Maud and Beatrice argued, and Whistler told them to go out and settle it in the street. They came to blows, harmless roundhouses, scratches, fists full of hair, until a blood vessel burst in Maud's sinuses. She went to a doctor, and Beatrice claimed it as a victory. Whistler painted Beatrice, clad in a large overcoat, to conceal her thick waist, her ample rump, and they began to travel out of London together. Maud became ill with worry and spent days in bed, punctuated by tantrums. Finally, she knew what Joanna had known. In despair, she modeled in other studios, and like Joanna, she posed nude for Courbet. Eventually, Maud moved to the country under the pretense that it would be good for her health, while Whistler and Beatrice attended society dinners to which Maud would never have been invited. She learned of their marriage from newspapers after they had already left for France. As Whistler crosses the Rue de Bac, sunlight glints off his monocle. He knows how this brilliant beacon unnerves people, but Maud does not avert her stare. He knows she sees behind his costume. She helped him create the image, so she knows every brush stroke. He is often caricatured in the newspapers, cartoon artists drawing an ill-proportioned figure, the large head on small, dapper body, the pale feather towering above piles of dark curls, the piercing eye, the opaque monocle, the brazen grimace anchored by the prow of mustaches. He steps up on the sidewalk and thrusts his face toward her, and a caricature of a caricature. The master does not appreciate being followed, he said. The master can very well do nothing about it, she said. This is a public street. Whistler finds it unacceptable, the way you shadow and haunt us. Tell Whistler he creates his own shadows, Maud says. No one is more haunting than his wife. As he sucks in his breath to express outrage, his mouth fills with whiskers, resembling some horrid sea creature. This is intolerable, he said. This from a man who has never been tolerant, Maud says. Whistler tolerated you for years. Tolerate. Let me suggest another word, Maud says. You cannot continue to follow us like this, he says. And for emphasis, he taps the pavement with his walking stick. He is quite out of breath and he pauses to inhale to fill his lungs. But before he can speak, Maud says, I know she is dying. He becomes still, his mouth open, gasping for air. How? How do you know this? He asks. The woman who takes in their laundry has told Maud. She has cancer, she says. This close, his right eye, the monocle eye, is grotesquely enlarged. It is a blossom of unfathomable fear. He whispers, this does not change anything. It means you will be alone, she says, like me. Whistler can be anything except that. Whistler cannot be alone. He tries to speak but finds no rebuttal. You can't, she says. It's always there on your canvas in every painting. You fear being alone. Perhaps it has something to do with your mother? He seems distracted, his eyes on her mouth. It's an old habit. He is studying her lips, committing to memory, color, and shape. He used to say in the middle of conversation, hold still. Yes, that. Just let me look at that. So she stopped smiling, taking it away from him. After Beatrice is gone, you and I will be the same, she says. We will both be alone, equally. Only I can live with it better than you ever will. It will age you, it will make you old. Even Whistler won't be able to paint his way out of that fog. And then you will die. You will leave only your paintings. You will have that, and that's more than I will ever have. But it will kill you. It will kill you, and you will be remembered. But even that won't be enough. Now he is curious. And you? After you are gone, I will never speak of Whistler. They will come and ask me to talk about the master so they can write about him, so they can recreate the man who made those paintings. What was he like all those years? I will not even receive them. You will be bitter, he said. Won't it poison your life? Bitter, yes. It's stronger than love. It will sustain me in my silence. I won't acknowledge that you ever existed. They'll never know what you really were. He seemed pushed and he takes a step backwards. Only a stab of his walking stick into the cobblestones prevents him from falling. He is about to speak, but Maud turns and walks down the sidewalk. You cannot walk away from Whistler, he says loudly. His anger, his only refuge, is gathering again. Then he bellows, no one walks away from Whistler. As Maud passes a flower shop, a woman leaning in the doorway looks at her, and then at the angry man down the street, and at her again. The woman is older, perhaps mid-50s. Though her face is in the shadows, her eyes are bright and gentle, a form of benediction.
Wow. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ellen. I'm sure that Ellen and John would welcome any questions or comments from anybody. You can unmute yourselves or you can put them in chat, whatever you would like, if you have any comments or questions.
Thank you both. I like the foil of John's reading after Ellen's descriptions.
Oh, thank you, Lindy.
I do good foil.
No, it's a wonderful combination. It did make me wonder very much about the question of gesture. And I know that Whistler liked photography. I don't know if he used it. Do you know, Elle? But I know that he supported it. But
I didn't see any images attributed to him that were photographs, Lindy.
But I think he looked at a lot of photography, and I think he liked it, but also the framing and the gesture and the forms in his images struck me as very sort of modern and photographic.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful, Lindy. Thanks.
We might mention that Lindy is really a remarkable photographer herself, and she has a book of her photographs coming out when, in the next year or so, Lindy?
In the next 3 weeks.
Next 3 weeks. Oh, right. That's great. Yeah, fabulous.
Right. Yes, indeed.
Well,
John, did you write what you just read?
Did I write it?
Yes.
Well, I don't know. It depends. What did you think?
I loved it.
Oh, well, then I wrote it. Yeah, I wrote it. Who is that? Who is speaking? I'm not sure who's speaking.
It's Rob.
Oh, Rob. Hey, Rob, how are you doing? Yeah, I wrote that.
It's
I'll
very
admit
good.
that.
I totally enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank
I
you.
loved it because it brought it so to life. That
Didn't it
Yeah.
though? Yeah, yeah.
There is a question from Nancy in the chat. It says, she says, nicely done, both of you, perfect duo, perfectly paired. And then she says, I was wondering what Whistler was inspired by for his aestheticism, thinking, and abstract work. He is after Impressionism, but very different.
I'm gonna let the PhD handle that question.
From what I understand of him, he wasn't taken at all by Impressionism. And quite frankly, I don't know, Nan, that I can answer to your question. It seems to me that he simply, if I may so say, had a feeling about art and artistic representation that led him in this direction that was so novel at the time. I don't know how else to put it. And as I mentioned, he created those nocturnes in the 70s when he returned from Chile, and there's no indication of why he went, what he may have seen there. Maybe something there interacted with him in a remarkable manner. I know I just can't answer your question. I'm sorry.
No, I think I mean he must have seen some impressionistic paintings and maybe he didn't like them, but there's mark making in them that perhaps inspired him, even though he might not have written about it. But you know, pretty revolutionary to be making those 3 paintings
Oh, absolutely.
in the 1800s, even before
Yep.
German expressionism or any kind of modernism. So, you know, I think that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I agree with you, Nan. He wasn't taken with Monet, though.
Right.
Oh, I'm remembering something Monet said when Whistler walked into room. I think that it was a restaurant, and he hollered, "Where's your muff?" Which was in feminism. Yeah.
but wasn't he very
I don't
taken?
think Monet thought very much of him. What?
But wasn't he very taken with Japanese woodcuts and with
Absolutely.
with, with prints, and also I think maybe with Stieglitz and the pictorialism with.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I mean, you can sort of see it almost when you see the atmospheric paintings that he did, and then you think a little bit of some of the steam in the photographs of the time too.
Well, just maybe so, Lindy. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Peter Goodrich, I believe, asked, was there any influence going on between Whistler and J.M.W. Turner?
Not that I read.
Okay.
But there is a likeness there. There's no doubt about it. But Turner was not a subject who came up in the research that I did. Although, yes, I can see that perfectly. Yeah. Yep.
So what? I just have a question. Did Whistler live long enough to realize that his painting of his mother was going to be his most famous painting, or
No?
No.
No,
Okay.
his work fell out of favor. And I'm going back to the Robert Hughes article, which was written in 87, and he said that it wasn't until 150 years after Whistler's birth that he had come to be recognized for the extraordinary artist that he was.
Yeah.
Where was his work shown, Elle?
I'm sorry?
Where was his work shown?
Well, it was shown eventually at the Royal Academy. One of his first paintings, Lindy, was rejected. I think the first Symphony in White was rejected and then was shown at the Salon of Refuses. And then there's can't pronounce the Grosvenor Gallery. Are you familiar?
Grosvenor.
Thank you. I knew I didn't
Grosvenor.
pronounce it correctly. And he exhibited there, I think, with something akin to regularity. That's all I can tell you. But he was in London,
Hmm.
so
There was a moment when he was at the Grosvenor that I remember reading about. I mean, his arrogance had no bounds, and it was, the gallery was quite packed with people, and the arrangement he had made with the gallery manager was that he would be paid at the conclusion of the exhibit. And he's standing there, and he all of a sudden shouts, everybody out, the show's over," until I get.
Oh.
And so
That's funny.
The manager gave him some money right then and there, I guess, but that's
But
that's the kind of guy he was.
but his work wasn't as much as many of us adore his oeuvre. His work just wasn't popular. So it wasn't exhibited with any regularity, as far as I know.
I love his landscapes.
Yes.
When did he pass away again?
Is it 1902?
1902, 1903. Yeah.
He's kind of a guy ahead of his time.
Well, he absolutely was. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
And that's probably why it was forgotten for so long, like Van Gogh. Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. All right. Any other questions or comments?
No, just that I learned so much because the only painting of his I really knew was Whistler's mother.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, to me, that's unfortunate. If you look beyond that one painting, it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
a bad
Yeah.
painting, but it
I
almost
absolutely
seems like
love
it's
the
by
fallen
somebody
rock.
other than Whistler. I mean, he painted these scenes in Venice, and I don't know, the Whistler's mother painting just it seems
It's not-
different. It's a whole different sensibility.
Really?
Meg, what did you say?
I absolutely love the fallen rocket. I could just live in that painting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
I have a final question for the two of you. What next?
Oh, God. I'm gonna have a beer. That's what.
Well, Marty and we haven't discussed that yet. Lindsay.
Yes.
Do you have any suggestions? Do you have a favorite? How about the glove out?
No, but I really hope, I don't know if you're being with an art historian all this time now, John, has sort of inspired a new dimension to your work to do this.
Well,
to do the kind of story that you did, and I hope that we're going to have more of that too.
Well, thank you. There's some seepage, some osmosis, I guess.
I think seepage is a better word.
Yeah. I mean, several years ago, I read. I have some Whistler books with the paintings and so forth, but I read several biographies of him. Compliments of Peter White Public Library, I'll mention. And I just discovered that his life was as remarkable and fascinating, and in many ways ugly, which is remarkable considering what kind of art he actually did create. And unfortunately, this is not an uncommon situation that someone who creates art that the world reveres during their life, their personal relationships and so forth, they're extremely difficult and outrageously out of line. And I think that's what you could say about him, certainly.
Yeah. As Robert Hughes wrote.
Yeah. Ellen has been, I'm kind of lobbying, and this isn't a guarantee, but I'm kind of lobbying for her to next do Goya. Because she is an enormous fan of Goya's, and she has taken me by the ear to galleries to see his work, and she's absolutely right. His eye, I think, was just quite remarkable in portraying in many cases, some of the horrors of human existence, particularly, wartime. But they're remarkably beautiful, even when they are portraying something that is horrific.
That would be wonderful.
So you'll do another story, John?
Probably no. I don't. I'm not going to do another story. This is Ellen's shit. I just happen to have this one story, and
But so well done.
well, thank you.
So I guess-
So I was just gonna say, so you might have just gotten a preview of what the next next one is gonna be. But here's the thing: when we start talking about this, it has to be over beer. Ellen and John and I get
Right.
together over
That's right.
beer, and then we plan it out. So once we get together and have a beer, we'll
All right.
have the next one.
right.
We'll see you next week.
That's right.
Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
yeah. We'll look
put our-
forward to it.
We'll put
Well,
we'll
thank
put our
you,
heads
Andy.
together. Get it, heads. Ha, ha, ha.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, dear.
All right.
Nice
Well,
to see you all. Thank you
Yeah,
for joining
and
us.
hey, Marty,
thank you,
for
Okay.
Ellen
making
and
this possible.
John.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Night,
Good
night.
night.
Yeah.
Night.
Great, thank you.
Captain Kirk, Dr. Spock.